All right, welcome everyone. Do you want to take a seat? Perfect. Okay, tonight it's a double hitter with Chris Roos from Southern Methodist University. Chris's talk today is going to look more at, so last night it was understanding fire and human interface, wildland, urban interface and fire, and using the archaeological record to understand how Native peoples have dealt with this in the past. And then today we're going to look at Native American fire management practices in the past from the archaeological record. Chris Roos he's a Renaissance man of pyro. I think he liked to burn things as a kid, maybe. He's a pyrogeographer. He's an archaeologist. He's a geoarchaeologist. He's always linking the environment and people together and throwing flame into the story too. So he uses the archaeological record and records of fire to reconstruct past conditions. For those who weren't here last night, Chris got his undergraduate at University of Cincinnati in anthropology. Then he went to the University of Arizona in Tucson and got a master's and a PhD. The master's was in anthropology, focused in archaeology. PhD, the same, but he also got focus in geosciences. So he has a little geoscience background. And just recently, we've added Chris as an adjunct faculty in the Department of Geosciences. So he's kind of one of us by proxy, I guess. And yeah, so Chris he's an interesting, unique way to blend different sciences together, very interdisciplinary. And if you were here for last night's talk, you're coming back again today because this is going to be a really great talk. Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Tammy. And thank you all for coming for round two. Yeah, this one will be a little bit different than yesterday, but as you can tell from the title and my pyro passion, it's not going to be too far removed from that. And like I did yesterday, I want to thank you for taking the masking thing seriously. You're helping to protect this adorable 3-year-old back in Dallas. And like I mentioned the last time, the work that I do is part of this kind of accelerating dimension of modern archaeology to look to the past human experiences for contemporary issues, right? Trying to find ways to learn from the past, to contribute to discourse or policy solutions related to those issues. And I'm not alone in this. List a few of the recent books that link to this, but this shows this growing interest in this way of thinking about the past. Well, yesterday, I tried to make the case to you that one of the ways that we could learn from the past is to help to give us options when trying to learn to live with fire today, right? We learn from how people lived so that we can imagine, since we really don't have much in the way of recent cultural history with fire as anything other than a hazard, right? We don't have a place to think about the positive benefits of fire or smoke. It's a hazard to be avoided. Today, I want to think about it a little bit differently. I want to think about the past as part of an expanded learning window for adaptive management, right? Adaptive management, as I like to think about it, and as this guy described it in the 1970s, right, is a combination of science, management, and a big dose of humility, right? That we simply can't know everything, and we can't know that all of our management exercises are going to do exactly what we think that they're going to do, right? And that's okay. That if we do this as scientists and as managers, we can learn from this, right? We have a window of time to learn about the consequences of these management activities and adjust based on what we learn. Well, one of my conceits as an applied archaeologist in this is that, the past human experience with environmental challenges and with actively managing those environments is one way of expanding the learning window of those sorts of experiments deep into the past, so that we can look at the consequences not on an interannual time scale, not on a decadal time scale, but on multi-decadal or centennial or even millennial time scales. But what happens when we do X in the context of certain types of climate variability or certain populations. And so this is what I'm trying to do with the case studies that I'll talk about today. And as I mentioned yesterday, one of the reasons we have the fire problems that we have today is because we enter these environments without a recognition of the history of fire in these places. Oftentimes we're attracted, and I'm using the royal we here, right, to these landscapes that have been shaped by fire because of those properties that have been shaped by fire, but with a thought that somehow we can live without it in these places. But even in contexts, and here I'm referring mostly to scientific and management contexts, in which we recognize the history of fire and shaping these places, we often overlook another part of that history, which is the deep human history of these places, right? And this is, of course, the expertise of archaeologists. This is what we do, work on the human history of landscapes. And I used this photo yesterday. I love it as much today as I did yesterday, maybe more. All right, this is the Pueblo of Taos and residents of the Pueblo of Taos in northern New Mexico sitting on their rooftops watching this fire burn the watershed behind the Pueblo. This Pueblo has been occupied for about 1,000 years in that spot. I can guarantee you this is not the first time people have sat on the roof of this Pueblo and watched fires burn on the landscapes around there. But this is probably the only time that they've sat on the roof and watched a fire burn that hot there. And so most of the time that scientists have approached this issue of fire and fire history in the Southwest, they've treated it with this kind of Western dichotomy, that fires were either entirely natural or they were entirely cultural. And it's a false dichotomy, as you guys probably readily appreciate, but this is nevertheless what characterized a lot of the literature, that either the fire regimes in these places were driven by people or they were driven by climate, right? And this is basically the real dichotomy here is who's driving the bus? Is it people, native people, or is it climate? A very brief dive into the literature already tells us that this is a false dichotomy and not a particularly meaningful one, certainly not one that's very elucidating. This is a paper that you probably wouldn't immediately go to, but came to mind to me about this dichotomy, which is a study of carbon emissions associated with wildfires during the big El Nino event of 97, 98. There's a big emissions pulse, and most of that's coming from Southeast Asia, and most of that in Southeast Asia is coming from Indonesia, right? And if you look at emissions variability over this window of time, there's very clearly a strong El Nino La Nina signal in this, right? There's a strong climate driver is the way a lot of people would think about that. But you would really miss the boat because most of that burning is in Southeast Asia, most of that is in Indonesia, and all of that is forest transformation for palm oil plantations. It's all people, right? People are the reason why this looks like it's all climate, right? Kind of wrap your head around that for a second, right? People are the reason that it looks like it's all climate. They're amplifying the climate signal in that case. This is something that we saw teasingly in some stratified records of charcoal deposits on the northern Great Plains associated with bison hunting by ancestors of Blackfoot Indians, where the abundance of fire activity really closely tracked, in this case, multi-year pluvials, where you have more fuel to burn. That's what the limiting factor is in these shortgrass prairies. And here it looks like they were amplifying what looked like the climate signal and fire activity on these. But generally what we think of is what we see, especially in frequent fire environments, is like what Rebecca Bleegey-Bird and colleagues reported for the Western Deserts of Australia, where they looked really closely at mixing ethnography with remote sensing to document the climate response of burn area, but also individual fire size from areas that were managed by Aboriginal people versus those that were not, that were more distant, that were lightning driven. And they were able to show very clearly that the response to climate was really muted. The term they use is buffered. in the Aboriginal managed landscape than others. And so this is kind of related to that dichotomy and the assumption that it's either climate or people, but it's really the interaction that we're talking about, and that the interaction is different. It's kind of my key point here. The interaction is different on these areas that are managed really intensively by people than it is on the less intensively managed landscapes. And so what I want to think about in the case studies I'll talk about today, and these are a little less well developed than the ones I talked about yesterday. These are in progress, and so I really welcome a discussion about all of these. Now, how do we consider the interaction of climate and people, right? And the consequences of that interaction at various time scales, at interannual time scales, decadal time scales, centennial time scales. What are the ecological consequences? How do these influence properties that matter to us, like the fire resilience of these forests, right? The vulnerability to transformations from forest to non-forest states, for example. And I restrict myself here primarily to ponderosa pine forests, as I did yesterday, because they're lovely and because we know the fire regime so well. It's probably one of the best known fire regimes in the world. Because of the tree ring record, where fires don't tend to kill the trees, but they can damage some of them, and that damage can be dated using tree ring dating methods to the year, and in many cases to the season in which this happened. So we know that in most of these forests, we're talking about fires that happen in some cases once or twice a decade, usually during what we call the arid foresummer, late spring and early summer before the summer monsoons come, and that there's a strong climate relationship with interannual moisture, especially El Nino, La Nina switching associated with these. These are southwestern ponderosa pine forests. I talked about the Millennium Falcon yesterday, and here I'm going to talk about an area within the largest continuous belt of ponderosa pine forests in the US in east central Arizona, along what's called the Mogollon Rim. And in the Mogollon Rim area, but also across the Southwest, right, the amount of fire that is killing trees, tree killing fires, and in many cases replacing them with other vegetation types is increasing over time. And the observant of you will have noticed, right, that tracks pretty closely with changes in the temperature anomaly. But climate is only part of the story, and pointing the finger exclusively at climate change misses key structural changes in these forests that are themselves related to fire that influence the abundance of these big tree killing fire events. And so just to kind of walk through what that looks like on the ground, some nice repeat photographs. You start with an open ponderosa pine forest or parkland, like this one outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, with a very high canopy, lots of sunlight coming down to support a nice grassy forest floor. But you take fire away, and what you have is an opportunity for synchronized recruitment of young trees. This largely happened in the 1920s, so these are all 20-some years old. They're all competing with each other for moisture, especially, making them much more vulnerable to drought stress. A few more decades, and they provide a nice ladder of fuels into that canopy. And it's these types of forests that are at the most vulnerable to fire, because fires that used to burn along the surface can now get into the canopy and run through the canopy, killing the trees and removing future seed sources. And it doesn't take much for that to happen. Severe drought makes it happen more frequently. In 2002, this happened in my study area. The Rodeo Chetaskai fire burned nearly 500,000 acres, leading to landscapes that look like this, with no regeneration at all of ponderosa pine. And some really interesting ecological work looking at post-fire succession suggests that even when forests do come back in a lot of these tree-killing crown fires, they come back in the same thick stands, or they become something else, right? And they're replaced by grasses or shrubs. And so here's a rough kind of resilience schematic, a ball and basin diagram, if you're used to seeing these sorts of things, where deeper basins sort of represent higher resilience. Thresholds between basins represent places where the feedbacks change and they become different systems. Basically, the idea is that with frequent surface fires, They thin out the young trees. They keep this type of open structure and high canopy, and they're really resilient, right? It's very difficult for fire, whether it's extreme drought conditions or extreme fire weather, to create the kind of tree killing fires that turn it into something else. But when you have stands like this, those doghair thickets, it takes a lot less, right, for fire to be this catalyst for change, because there's a loss of resilience in that process. Dave McWethy and others published a paper about the relationship between climate, fuel production, and human influence that suggests that in the kind of dry forest types we're talking about here, I don't know if we would put them here or here, there's not a lot of room for human activity to, say, increase fire, because there's already so much fire on those landscapes. The biggest impact is in fire suppression. But one of the things that I think we can explore here is whether or not that's true at all times, right? Whether or not there are times in which climate might make some forest stands less resilient or more vulnerable to those sorts of tree killing fires, and in which case having human beings might matter a lot. And so this is what I want to try to explore with the first case here, is how did Southwestern forests with Native Americans, fire-using Native Americans, respond to climate changes differently than those without them? And can we learn from that experience to influence the fire resilience today? And coming from this body of resilience thinking, my suspicion is that fire-using indigenous societies in lightning-rich, fire-prone contexts provide something that we call functional redundancy, right? That, like lightning, they start fires. That's the simple thing, right? They're functionally redundant in that sense, is they provide that role. But they also provide something that tends to give systems generalized resilience, which is response diversity. People don't respond to changes, environmental changes, social changes, climate changes in the same way that lightning does. As far as I know, lightning's pretty agnostic, right? It just does what it does, and it starts fires where it starts fires. But people are different, right? They respond to environmental cues and social cues to make decisions about where and when to put fire, of what kind and of what size. And so my hypothesis going into this study in Eastern Arizona was that having people on this landscape may be very difficult to see in sometimes, because there's so much lightning anyway. But in sometimes when maybe lightning is less efficient at burning lots of area, having people would make those forests more fire resilient. I introduced this yesterday. This is the classic fire-climate relationship in these ponderosa pine forests. And then this matters for us a little bit here, because this is how I reconstruct kind of a long-term story of what climate might do to influence when some stands might be more vulnerable to these sorts of tree-killing fires than others. And it's not just about drought or wet periods. It's about the abundance or the frequency of these types of wet-dry switching conditions. Right? This is kind of the canonical fire-climate relationship, where you've got between 1 and 3 wet years before that build fine fuels that are then able to burn in widespread fires during dry years. And with Tom Swetnam, former director of the Tree Ring Lab and a close collaborator of mine, we used basic tree ring paleoclimate methods and applied them to fire scars and paleoclimate reconstruction. So rather than, say, using ring width to reconstruct temperature or precipitation in the past, we used fire scars, specifically the percentage of fire scar localities across the southern Colorado Plateau that burned in a given year, to calibrate a reconstruction with a multiple regression using the prior climate and fire year climate to predict that value of how many sites were burning in a given year. And this is for the calibration period here, 1700 to 1900. And this is the full reconstruction. And so it replicates the canonical pattern. It's basically 2 years of precipitation beforehand, and then fire year precipitation in the model. And it explains about 50% of the variability in fire scar sites burn, which is pretty good, right? If this was a paleoclimate reconstruction, we'd be really psyched about how effective this was at predicting the dependent variable. And so one thing that you'll notice here too is that when you hit the 20th century, or really the 1890s, that pattern breaks down, or this is outside of the calibration period. So we're predicting lots of fire, and there wasn't a lot of fire. So what happens? Well, sheep happens. It's the saying, right? Starting in the late 19th century, all right, with the connection of the transcontinental railroads, livestock, especially cattle and sheep, just fill the Southwest, right? Now, New Mexico was the envy of Wales in the late 19th century in terms of sheep per unit area. And they're just consuming the fuels before the fires can, right? And it's this competitive interaction between herbivores and fire. But so the long-term record that really matters for us, and I want to point out, this is from that same paper. So this is the annual reconstruction at the top. But what's down here are the frequencies of years in which 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviation above the mean proportions of those sites burn. So you think of it as widespread fire years across the region. And there are a couple windows of time here in the 700s and the 1300s to 1400s when those conditions aren't really common. There's a lot less interannual variability. So you just have less of the wet dry switching to make things conducive for widespread fires. And this one really caught our interest because this is a really dynamic period of time in the cultural history of the Southwest. For those of you who know, Chaco Canyons, this great cultural fluorescence through the mid 1100s, probably the center of a kind of a larger political network. That collapses in the 1100s. There begins some reorganization over the next couple centuries, but by the 1300s, basically populations have clustered into a very few areas. So there's an opportunity to look at places that had lots of people before, but by the time you get to this period, there are very few people, or just in a few clusters of places. So we can basically look at places that have people and that don't have people. And with the idea of testing whether or not people mattered in those periods of time to keep forests like this versus the places without people, whether or not we have evidence for them forests becoming like this, either just becoming overdense or actually being vulnerable to tree killing fires. So I want to talk a little bit about the culture history here. It's a little more complex than at Jemez. Jemez, it's just ancestors of Jemez Pueblo. The culture history in the Mogollon Rim area is a little bit more complicated. Here I'm working basically in the area between Heber and Shola for most of my study sites. And I'm going to concentrate really on the last 1,000 years because that's where most of my sedimentary records are. And we have kind of a gradient of land use from unused watersheds through short used watersheds and long used watersheds. At about 1,000 years ago until about 1275, this was the period of peak population. There were lots of people and they were everywhere, right? They lived mostly in relatively small settlements. This is a relatively big one from the Forestdale Valley, which is directly underneath it, where you may have had maybe as many as 10 families living there. So they're relatively small settlements, but they were all over the place. And this is true for a lot of the Southwest, really widely dispersed populations. But by 1275, with the depopulation of the Four Corners area and the Four Corners Great Drought, you've got people of different backgrounds moving around the Southwest, and you see the creation of aggregated communities that are multi-ethnic, right? These include people from different backgrounds, which is, this is interesting as an anthropologist, but for us, it's important because it made many of these communities very unstable because they were trying to find ways to integrate people from different backgrounds, and some of these just didn't last very long. So these are a couple from the occupied watersheds we have that were established in the late 1200s, multi-ethnic communities. This one here on the left, the Bailey Ruin, only made it to about 1325 before those people moved elsewhere. The one on the right, the Tunastusa Ruin in the Forestdale Valley, persisted at least until 1400, maybe even until 1425, before those people moved on elsewhere. After 1400, 1425, this area was traversed by part of the Coronado expedition. And we know that the people weren't living here. Right? The Coronado expedition doesn't describe anybody living here. They call this Tierra Despoblada. The indigenous guides of the Coronado expedition didn't think anybody lived there. They didn't talk about anybody living there. So it looks like this was, if it was occupied, it was very lightly used for very long for this period of time. But by the Oñate expedition from the Rio Grande westward, there are very clearly Apache people living in the Mogollon Rim region. And the oldest archaeology we have also kind of corresponds to this period of time, the late 16th century So very clearly, Apache people, presumably Western Apache or ancestors of Western Apache people, were living in this area by the late 16th century. And on parts of this area they live today. Below the Mogollon Rim here is the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, and the Forestdale Valley is on that reservation today. So we've got never occupied sites, places with short occupations where the Bailey ruin was, meaning it was depopulated by 1325, which remember is actually before that window of possible climate vulnerability to tree killing fires, and then long occupied until 1400, 1425, overlapping with that period of time in which you would have had native people keeping fire on the landscape when maybe lightning was less efficient at spreading fire. From the ethnography, we have a good idea about how native people used fire. This is a slide from before we were doing our HEMAS work, but there's kind of archaeological and ethnographic information about Pueblo people using fire for hunting and agricultural practices, maybe manipulating wild plant foods more intensively at certain periods of time. Western Apaches, we know a lot better. They were using fire up to and including the early ethnographic period. So there's a great PhD dissertation from the 1930s, so it wasn't published till the 80s, listing all of these uses of fire and horticulture and wild resource processing and hunting by Western Apache peoples. And I mentioned this yesterday, of course. This is that cute guy that I talked about, the tuft-eared squirrel, the Abert squirrel. It's endemic to Ponderosa pine forests. That is the keeper of fire from which Western Apaches learned how fire worked, and have some suspicions that that might be very old knowledge. The Athabascan language speakers here in southwestern Canada are the source population, everyone thinks, for Western Apaches, and they could have effectively island hopped Ponderosa pine forests down into the Southwest. So not necessarily something they learned there, but actually brought with them. The geoarchaeologist in me feels obligated to tell you that most of what we did in terms of field work for this study was actually alluvial geoarchaeology, focusing on first order discontinuous ephemeral streams that don't have water running them, although the Forestdale Valley has it a little bit still. But these are characterized by these alternating incised and fan accumulating reaches. And we concentrated our efforts on these kind of fan reaches where they're upbuilding sediment in between periods of incision. And we did this because there aren't lakes, so you can't do classic lake core paleo fire work. These are the sedimentary deposits that are spread all over the place around these archaeological sites. And the indicators of fire, like charcoal, and this is just charcoal-rich water after a fire in Colorado, get redeposited into these things. So that we know that the sedimentary byproducts do end up in these alluvial contexts, and so they seem like suitable places to look. So we would walk these drainages, cut exposures, cut little trenches, take a wide variety of samples for charcoal, for pollen, radiocarbon dating, soil characterization, and soil micromorphology. Did this across 4 different watersheds, 2 that we call control because they had no human occupation, and then 2 occupied ones, one that had a short occupation, one a long one. And overall, we had 6 localities that we looked at, 3 of them giving us some replication from the Forestdale Valley. But we also were keenly aware that we may not have a good idea about what, say, a crown fire would look like in these sedimentary contexts. So we went around and sampled after the Rodeo Chetaskai fire and these fan contexts that hadn't accumulated much, but we get surface context from those. And from a 1970s crown fire that built up a little fan in one of these drainages that we could also look at. I'll show you what that looks like. So that way we'd have kind of a calibration to what high severity fires look like in these. And so this is the record from the control watersheds. They're plotted together by time here. This is charcoal on the bottom, this is pine pollen, and this is the sedimentation rate. These basically both built up as cumulic soils gradually over time, but they both start with effectively no pine pollen. Very, very low, which is weird because pine pollen travels really widely. And so these watersheds had little to no pine in them when they started accumulating. They didn't have much in the way of charcoal either, which is kind of counterintuitive if you think that this may have been a big fire in there. But these were also both really small first order drainages that I think involved a lot of erosion and scouring rather than deposition in the wake of this. We think this because in both of these contexts, here dating to the mid 1300s and mid 1400s, we see reworked charcoal exhumed from old soils. that basically build up in the beginning of this. So, and we see this in the radiocarbon dates too. They get these old radiocarbon dates that are reworked with younger ones at the bottom of these. The way that we reconstruct this is that these had a fire that killed the trees over the top, had pretty substantial post-fire erosion that took the charcoal from the fire out of the system. And then when they started accumulating again, it was with sediments that had been eroding from soils upslope and these bottoms, but without much in the way of pine pollen because there weren't trees in those watersheds anymore. It's not until about a couple hundred years later that we see pine regenerate at the same time that charcoal begins to accumulate. And we think that they're more forest-like fuel conditions in those settings. So in short, we think that there were tree killing fires in the mid 1300s and mid 1400s in those controlled watersheds. In the short occupied watershed, the basal sediments that you can see here look an awful lot like that 1970s Crown Fire. Here there's the actual stratigraphic data. You can see that how they match in terms of unburnt carbon, basically from detrital organic material being eroded and deposited there. Charcoal, pine pollen concentration, which is unusually high. That's adhering to that unburned plant tissues that are deposited there. Really high sedimentation rates that are preserving the bedding features. And that's also in the mid 1400s. So the blue here indicates the early cultural period that we don't have any record for, where presumably people were using fire, but we don't know. And this later period where you've got a lot of these are this is soil nutrients. This is phosphorus. These are our sedimentary landscapes with very low nutrient soils. And so phosphorus and ash is a big source for these soils. Basically ruderal pollen correspond to this period of Apache use that is probably related to burning for wild plants that are economically important, that are among those ruderals. In the Forestdale Valley, the early occupation period lasts longer. It's characterized by a lot of charcoal, but basically pine forest-like pollen assemblages. So there's a lot of fire, but it's not forest-altering fire. It's probably a lot of fire. For agriculture, we get Zea mays pollen from the same period of time during this early window, and that declines by the time people leave. Right, the amount of charcoal changes. The pollen assemblage doesn't really change. It's still a pine forest. You just lose that human element of extra burning. But when Apaches show up again, you see that increase in ruderals in the pollen and increase in phosphorus, suggesting there's a lot of plant ash and a lot of ruderal plants being promoted by the fires that persist in this period of time. And so we plot that kind of over time with the climate records. This is a different way of looking at that tree ring model that I showed you. I call this a sawtooth model, where this is basically the cumulative time since the last one of those regional fire years. And so the big peaks are basically periods when it's been a long time since the model predicted there would be a big widespread fire year. So these are the windows of time when those wet dry switching was really uncommon. This is temperature here. This is actually a Great Basin record because it's the kind of the best one I have to use. And this is PDSI for the Mogollon Rim from tree ring reconstructions. And I mentioned yesterday in the comments that there was a period in the early 1600s where it was wet and cool, and there was a long period without fire that allowed for a regional scale germination. Right, that's it. That's what I was talking about right here is that period of time. And so our control watershed, right, the yellow we think has evidence for crown fires in the 1300s and 1400s. In the short occupied watershed, we think there's crown fire in the 1400s, but in the long occupied watershed, we don't have any evidence for that. And so that it's only a few watersheds. It's only one part of the Southwest, but it does tentatively fit that model, which having people out there adding extra ignitions gives some extra response diversity to these in the context of climate fluctuations that might create some forest vulnerability to wildfires. And so we think something like this, right? That the long occupied watersheds kept forests in this state, whereas those without people and some stands ended up being more vulnerable to crown fires. So from that, we think that one of the consequences of having all these small fires, right? And we still do think there's basically lots and lots of small fires that Native people are adding onto a landscape that already has lightning, that already has fire anyway. that one of the long-term consequences that it may buffer that against climate influences on fire resilience, low frequency variation in climate over time. In a more recent project, something that's ongoing right now with Chris Gitterman, Ellis Margolis, and Tom Swetnam, we're trying to look at shorter timescales and across different cultural contexts, how different types of cultural applications of fire might impact fire-climate relationships, and how that might be influenced across spatial scales. So we get back to this canonical pattern, right? And the importance of this for our expectations about what fire-climate relationships are like in these dry forests, right? They're dry, they need the extra moisture for fuels in order for fires to spread widely. And so we expect to see that. We see this across scales in the Southwest and many dry Western forests. In our study, we take a couple of different subsets. This one is a snapshot from the International Multi-Proxy Paleofire Database, all the tree ring sites from the Southwest, which are these diamonds here, to get our regional picture of fire-climate relationships, which is what we have here. And then we drilled into a richer data set from the North America Fire Scar Network for the yellow circles, which are our detailed analysis for the Jemez cultural area, the Navajo cultural area, and Apacheria in southeastern Arizona. And so our expectations are, these are different cultures, right? Jemez folks are settled village farmers. Navajo, many of them through much of this period of time were semi-mobile, semi-sedentary pastoralists. And Apaches here, Western Apaches and Chiricahua Apaches, were fairly mobile forager, gardener, hunters. And that we might see different fire-climate relationships based on those different fire uses. But this is what the regional scale looks like for all fire years for about 450 years of fires. To make it a little easier to see, right? This holds for a wide variety of hydroclimate variables, but even temperature, right? So this is PDSI, annual PDSI. Well, it's actually summer PDSI, but you see that canonical pattern. Wet periods before the fire and a dry fire year, right? So you can see what this looks like in the real data. In winter precipitation, the same thing, significantly wet years beforehand and a dry fire year. Even in summer precipitation, which is a little surprising, wet conditions prior and a dry fire year. This is the El Nino, this is the Nino 3 index of El Nino Southern Oscillation. In this case, these are El Nino years, wet years beforehand, and a dry La Nina fire year. Temperature, it's switched, right? Cool pre-fire years and warm fire years. Right, so this is really robust. So I'm going to focus just on PDSI for everything else, but you can see that this shows up across climate variables. And so I'm going to start with Jemez because we talked about Jemez yesterday. And so you saw a hint of what prompted us to do this, right? We'd already seen from our work published in 2016 that in a couple stands in the Jemez, during the Jemez intensive use period prior to, in that case, we used 1680, here we're using 1650, that you saw the climate pattern break down. But after that, you saw the strong canonical climate relationship. And so here we're using a different data set across scales. So these are the local scales. I just picked in this case, I've picked one that's at the largest sample depth for that period of time to show you, but I'll talk about the others here in a minute. The entire landscape, which is all of those Jemez sites together, and this is the regional data set, so the IMPD sites. And so what you see here is that most commonly, you see no fire climate pattern at the local scale. Right, that's not in all cases, but the most common pattern that you see is no pattern, right? There's no climate driver to fire activity at the local scale. At the landscape scale, we see fire year drought persist, but interestingly, not antecedent moisture, right? We think from the canonical pattern that this must be really important. These are dry forests. They need the fuels, right, to carry the fires, but that's not what shows up at the landscape scale here. It does at the regional scale. So for the same period of time, these are all for prior to 1650. This pattern definitely holds at the largest scale, not so much at the landscape scale and not at all really at the local scale. But if you look after 1650, right, when there's much lighter use, I don't want to say that Jemez people weren't there, but there's much lighter use. At the local scale, you see climate patterns pretty frequently. Not all of them are nice and canonical like this one is. Sometimes it's just fire year drought, or it's just antecedent moisture. But some climate driver on local fire activity is present in most of the sites, even the sites that had no climate pattern during the cultural period. At the landscape scale, well, that canonical pattern is there, right? Antecedent moisture matters for building fuels and ultimately being burned. And of course, at the regional scale, the canonical pattern holds as well. At Navajo, right, these are, as I mentioned, we mostly think of Navajo as semi-sedentary, somewhat mobile pastoralists. That doesn't characterize all of Navajo history. And prior to 1760 in the Chuscas and Lukachucais and Defiance Plateau, there were almost certainly Navajo people there, just had a much lower density and a much more forager-dominated lifestyle. But in about 1760, basically, the more hogan building, sheep pastoral folks moved out of the San Juan Basin in New Mexico into the mountains. You see it really clearly in the more intensive land use up in this area that we're calling our Navajo study area. And the same thing here, most commonly at the local scale, you don't see any fire climate patterns during the most intensive period. In this case, it's after 1760 is the period we're looking at. But at the landscape scale, fire year drought persists. Here, it's interesting that you don't see antecedent moisture in the regional data set. But I'll come back to that. If you look at the actual values, it's actually comparable to others. It's an artifact of a really small sample size here in terms of the statistical significance. But at in the less intensive, low cultural period, you see climate drivers more commonly at the local scale. The canonical pattern characterizes the landscape scale, and the canonical pattern characterizes the regional scale for prior to 1760. In the Sky Islands of southeastern Arizona, we really focused on 4 of these because they had enough samples, right? We restricted ourselves to really robust sample sets. I'll show you the sample sizes in a minute. At least about 250 trees was our limit. We wanted to have a large sample to draw from. This I'm showing you at the local and landscape scale. This is from the Pinaleños. That at the local scale, again, dominated by no pattern, right? At the landscape scale, fire year drought persists. This is a sub-regional scale. This is kind of all across southeastern Arizona, the Sky Islands together. You still see a bit of the canonical pattern, and you see this. Now here, the cultural period is different, right? Apachery is tough because there are Apaches there this whole time, right? The whole tree ring records, and they move around enough that it's really tricky to know how to parse it very finely. So what we've done is use these wartime periods identified by Mark Kaib, another fire scientist, from historical documents that are periods when first the Spanish and then the Mexicans and then the Americans were really aggressively pursuing and engaging in warfare with the Apaches. And our hypothesis here is that those are periods of time in which kind of traditional cultural uses of fire would have been very risky because they would have given away your position and made it easier for pursuit. And that in wartime periods, it's not to say that they didn't use fire. In fact, Mark makes a really strong case that they did, aggressively burning out pastures to prevent grazing for military horses or to disguise their immediate escape when they're being pursued. But it's different, right? And so it's not exactly a light use, it's just a different use for this second period of time. But the important thing being a lot less of the traditional cultural practices in the second period of time. And at the local scale, we see a lot more climate drivers, like in those light use in those other contexts. And the landscape scale, we see more climate and the canonical pattern at the sub-regional and regional scale for the wartime periods. So it looks more like the light use periods at Jemez and Navajo than it does the peacetime periods. But it's also a little different. You'll see that when I show you the other. This is just the Pinaleños. It's different from mountain range to mountain range. So aggregating all the local scale, just to kind of reiterate the point, right? Across these local scales, climate doesn't seem to be a big factor during the cultural periods, but it's not because it just doesn't show up. It's a scalar phenomenon, and you don't see it because outside, or when you go to the low use period, climate drivers are there, right? They're there, and they're not just important, they're the dominant mode of patterns that we see in fire climate relationships, or some drivers of some kind, and oftentimes the canonical one. So this shows those with statistically significant patterns. So in bold, right, at Jemez, at the Chiricahuas, the Pinaleños, and the Rincons, the difference between the abundance of no climate pattern versus the abundance of climate pattern in the cultural versus non-cultural periods are statistically significant. They're really big, and some of these are really, they're on opposite poles of what they are. The Navajo, it's also, that pattern is there. It's not significant at the 0.05 level. It's significant at the 0.08 level, but the pattern is still present. The Catalinas, as I mentioned, they're kind of weird, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the Catalinas. At the landscape scale, here's where you'll see the weirdness of the Catalinas. In most of these contexts, we see fire year drought persist in the cultural period, whereas in the non-cultural period, we mostly see the canonical pattern. In Apacheria, it's a little tricky. Like in the Chiricahuas, it's fire year drought all the way through. In Catalinas, it's weird because it's all antecedent moisture, not drought at all. And I don't have a great explanation for what's going on there. And then at the landscape scale, right, it's the canonical pattern. Even Navajo, right, if you look at the actual values, this would be significant if it had a larger sample size, right? It just has so few fires. So the takeaway for me, right, if we treat these as learning windows about the consequences of these indigenous burning strategies, right? One, that if we were to support more of this type of burning, it might make these forests more resilient to certain types of forest and fire changes, right? Because of the added ignitions and the heterogeneity that's kind of created by that simultaneous lightning and human burning. But also that that type of burning can buffer, at least at the local scale, and maybe a bit at the landscape scale, the consequences of interannual climate fluctuations on how much actually gets burned by putting out lots and lots of these small fires that can influence fire size and fire occurrence because they create fire breaks, right? If you've got a recently burned patch, there's not fuel there that another fire can come and burn. And so my conceit in all this is, right, that we really have an opportunity that we haven't taken full advantage of yet to learn from generations, hundreds of generations of experiences with management experiments, effectively, in these environments that we're struggling with today. And that if we ask the right questions and look at it the right way, and if I can convince more of you to do this, and I'm not quite out here by myself, that we can get a better grapple on this, right? We can learn the things that worked, but for as much as I've emphasized positive things today, it doesn't mean that all lessons are positive, right? We can learn from things that didn't work too, in terms of what sort of mistakes not to make. Or we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yesterday, I said we didn't have to choose from an empty menu about how to live with fire. Here I'm saying that we don't have to feel like we have to create all of this knowledge and experience on our own when we have hundreds of generations of this from indigenous people living on these environments in the past. And with that, I thank you and thank my partners and funders. Thanks, guys.
Okay, I'm gonna walk around with a